Thank you for invitation and thank you for introduction. Thank you for giving me an opportunity for presentation. The title of my talk today is Morpho-Syntactic Contrast between Korean and Japanese. Introduction. The genetic relationship between Korean and Japanese and their affinity with the Altai language is one of the most disputed topics in historical linguistics. Major obstacles are scarcity of written data and comparatively small number of lexical correspondences. As it is still disputable, we would not touch upon the issue of genetic relationship between two languages in this paper. On the other hand, when it comes to typological similarities, it is a well-known fact that Japanese and Korean display remarkable structural similarities in morphosyntax and lexicon. However, if we investigate more carefully and systematically, the two languages manifest subtle yet consistent differences in form, meaning, correspondences. Section 2, Structural Grammatical Similarities between Japanese and Korean. Japanese and Korean manifest remarkable similarities in lexicogrammatical structures. The structural similarity between Japanese and Korean is summarized by Miller-Gotama 1993 as in number 1. Table 1 presents a selection of representative lexicogrammatical phenomena where the two languages show remarkable similarity. In addition to lexicogrammatical similarities presented in Table 1, the presence of converb can be noted another striking similarity, as in number 2. Sequence of coordinating converb plus another verb tends to become grammaticalized to create aspectual or pseudo-aspectual forms. For example, verb plus C is found to express tri-verbing in Korean and Japanese, and verb plus put is found to express an action carried out in readiness for future situation, as in number 3. Completion with a sense of irreversibility and therefore implication of regret is expressed by Korean 버리다 and Japanese 대심하오, as in number 4. Furthermore, Japanese and Korean exhibit many other striking similarities and parallelism in grammatical structures. Among many others, the conventionalized use of conditional constructions for deontic and other modalities can be an example. Consider example 5, in which a conditional construction is used to express a deontic modality. Japanese and Korean show a parallelism in that both languages use a conditional and double negative to express a deontic modality. The construction can be one of the specialized patterns that are generally considered the closest equivalent to the modal auxiliary constructions in other languages. In addition, Korean and Japanese share morphological means of subject and addressee honorification, or speech levels. Korean has developed 6 different levels, whereas Japanese is typically treated as having just 2 levels, plain and polite. However, in Japanese, one can argue for more levels, as in number 6, in this case, 3 levels. In contrast, the two languages differ considerably in terms of phonological structure. Considerably different phonological structures and absence of convincing historical evidence make it extremely difficult to establish their genetic relationship. Moreover, there are significant differences between Japanese and Korean. For example, Japanese is often cited as a canonical example of a language with systematic differences between male and female speech, with a stronger tendency for women to use politer speech styles and tag questions. Japanese male-female differences are most realized in the choice of pronouns and sentence final particles, whereas Korean has relatively few male-female differences. Let us now move on to examine some structural similarities between Korean and Japanese. Section 3, structural differences between Korean and Japanese. 3.1, verb-oriented structure versus noun-oriented structure. If you compare Korean with Japanese, it is revealed that Korean tends to be verb-oriented and Japanese to be noun-oriented. This is a very widely applicable characteristic to explain the difference between the two languages. Example number 7 to 9 are some examples from Kim-Eun 2003. Consider examples 7, 8, and 9. If you compare Japanese A and Korean B, Japanese tends to use nominal structures in A, whereas Korean tends to use verbal structures in B. There are some more examples as in number 10 and 11. Here again, Japanese tends to adopt nominal structures and Korean tends to adopt verbal structures. This tendency extends to clause levels as well. The examples in clause levels, as in number 12 to 13, also reveal the verbal-oriented structure and the nominal-oriented structure in two languages. So number 12, in noun-modifying clause in Japanese adopt nominal clause, whereas in 13 in Korean, noun-modifying clause use verbal structures. In A, Japanese noun-modifying clause tend to adopt nominal clause, whereas in B, Korean noun-modifying clause normally adopt a verbal clause. The above data show that Korean tends to be verb-oriented and Japanese to be noun-oriented. Let's move on to section 3.2, asymmetry between agent-oriented constructions and affectee-oriented constructions. In Japanese, addition of the auxiliary te yasuru or te ageru, meaning give, to the main verb of a clause forms a benefactive construction, increasing the number of arguments by 1. Songnam-san 2005 called this new argument affectee. The affectee is defined as a semantic role to be assigned to an entity which is acted on by someone or influenced by an event or situation. Consider the example 14. 14b is a benefactive construction. The same event can be described making Mary the subject by attaching te morau or te itadaku, meaning receive, to the verb, as in number 15. 메리가 존니 구르마오 갖대 mor았다. Example 14b is an agent-oriented benefactive construction, while 15 is an affectee-oriented construction. They have the same meaning from a different angle. However, the distribution of agent-oriented benefactive constructions and affectee-oriented ones show considerable asymmetry. Formation of benefactive construction with te yaru or te ageru is possible only when the output or the situation created by the verb can be given or offered to the affectee, as illustrated in 16. For instance, benefactive formation is allowed in 16d, since it means that some space is created for Mary by John's opening the door, whereas it is banned in 16e, since the sentence does not mean that something was created for Mary by John's shutting the door. On the other hand, example in 17 indicates that there is no such constraint on the derivation of the affectee-oriented benefactive. They are all possible in number 17. Furthermore, affectee-oriented benefactives can be formed even if the event or the action expressed is not directed to the affectee. We can use 18 either in the situation where John ate a lot to please Mary, or in the situation where John ate a lot and happened to please Mary. 메리가 존이 닭상 다베 때 몰았다. Affectee-oriented benefactive 18 is very similar to the indirect passive 19 in terms of the indirect relation between the event and affectedness. They only differ in that 18 express beneficial affectedness while 19 express adverse affectedness. Thus, Japanese has two ways to express an indirect affectee as an argument of affectee-oriented constructions, while it has no way to express it as an argument of agent-oriented sentences like 20. Number 20 example is out, ungrammatical. This observation leads us to conclude that affectee-oriented constructions have wider scope to express the affectee than agent-oriented construction in Japanese. Let's look at Korean. Korean has the agent-oriented benefactive, as Japanese does, which is formed by adding the auxiliary 주다, meaning give, to the main verb, as in number 21. Like Japanese, in Korean, benefactive formation is allowed in 21D, since it means that some space is created for Mary by John's opening the door. Whereas it is not allowed in 21E, since the sentence does not mean that something was created for Mary by John's shutting the door. Korean, on the other hand, does not have any affectee-oriented benefactive as in number 22. 22 is ungrammatical in Korean. Korean examples above indicate that agent-oriented constructions have wider scope to express the affectee than affectee-oriented constructions do. The discussion so far leads us to an assumption that given a situation in which some affectedness must be expressed, Korean tends to employ the agent-oriented construction, whereas Japanese tends to employ the affectee-oriented construction. In other words, Korean is more agent-oriented than Japanese in terms of expression of affectedness. Now let's move on to section 4. Explaining the contrast based on Hawkins' morphosyntactic parameters. In this section, we will critically examine the relevance of Hawkins' morphosyntactic parameters in explicating morphosyntactic differences between Japanese and Korean. We'll show that Japanese tends to show itself toward greater surface structural ambiguity, whereas Korean is shown to be consistently more rigid than Japanese in assigning one meaning to one form. Hawkins' 1986 AB proposed the morphosyntactic parameters in 23 to capture the nature of a cross-linguistic contrast between English and German. If you look at example 23, morphosyntactic parameters used by Hawkins, like more or less grammatical morphology, more or less semantic diversity of grammatical relations, and so on. Hawkins' primary concern was to present a unified account of morphosyntactic contrast exhibited by German and English. The major morphosyntactic contrast between German and English discussed by Hawkins are presented in Table 2. In table 2, compare German with English. German is more grammatical morphology. English adopts less grammatical morphology. German has more word order freedom. English has less word order freedom, and so on. Hawkins' theory of comparative typology was applied beyond English and German to a wide range of languages in Miller-Gotama 1993 and provides its cross-linguistic applicability. The languages investigated by Miller-Gotama include Babungo, Chinese, Dutch, Indonesian, Jakarta, Japanese, Korean, Malayalam, and Turkish. Let us now examine Hawkins parameters one by one. Section 4.1, Grammatical Morphology. Consider Hawkins parameter number 1, Grammatical Morphology. Japanese and Korean are both characterized as agglutinating language in terms of morphological typology. Both Japanese and Korean exhibit this characterization, as shown in number 24. In 24a and 24b, it is noteworthy that two major parts of speech, namely nouns and verb, are immediately followed by segmentable bound morphemes with specific grammatical meanings in both languages. While Japanese and Korean appear to show similar morphological typological properties, there are subtle yet consistent differences between the morphological structures of the two languages, particularly with respect to predicate structures. Specifically, Japanese tends to show a greater degree of collapsing of grammatical meanings into a single predicate form than Korean. One of the most revealing instances of this contrast is the sentence final declarative mood suffix in Korean. Korean overtly encodes declarative mood in predicate forms, whereas Japanese fails to encode this grammatical category overtly. This contrast can be illustrated by examples 25a and 25b. In 25a, Korean overtly encodes declarative mood by means of a segmental suffix ta. In Japanese, in contrast, the category of declarative mood is not expressed overtly, merging with suffix ru and ta, respectively signaling present and past tense. This contrast in grammatical morphology is not accidental, and it is confirmed by a detailed comparison of predicate inflectional paradigms presented in Table 3 and Table 4. Consider Table 3 and Table 4. Japanese does not separately encode the declarative mood and past tense. In addition, some of the sentence final forms and adnominal forms overlap. In this sense, Korean shows a greater degree of transparency of grammatical meaning into a single predicate form. In other words, Japanese shows lesser degree of transparency in terms of grammatical form and meaning in grammatical morphology. Now let's move on to section 4.2, semantic diversity of grammatical relations. By parameter 2, namely semantic diversity of grammatical relations, Hawkins drew attention to the fact that English grammatical relations in general, and subject in particular, can potentially encode more varied semantic roles than German, as shown in number 26 to 29. So if you look at example 26 and 29, then you can see English grammatical subjects accommodate more varied semantic roles, whereas German subject does not allow locative subject and instrumental subjects. A similar contrast does not emerge between Japanese and Korean, wherein subjects are typically restricted to the semantic roles of agent and experiencer and less frequently locative and instrumental, as you can see number 30 to 33. In both Japanese and Korean, whereas agentive and experiencer subjects are perfectly acceptable, as in 30 to 31, locative and instrumental subjects are not well acceptable in 32 and 33. The fact that Japanese and Korean subjects show similar semantic restrictedness appears to suggest that parameter 2, semantic diversity of grammatical relations, is not relevant in highlighting morphosyntactic difference between the two languages. However, this is not the case in other constructions. If we drew attention to the passive constructions, the passives in Korean are exceedingly rare, occurring much less frequently than in English and in Japanese. Korean passives severely constrained, whereas Japanese use passivization extensively in contrast to Korean. Passivization is a grammatical relation changing process that involves the syntactic reorganization of a basic structure, and such a grammatical relation changing process constitutes a distortion of the semantic transparency. The fact that Korean uses less passivization than Japanese means that Korean is semantically more transparent than Japanese. It is widely known that Japanese has two types of passive strategy: the neutral passive, which functions generally like the passive in English, and the affective passive, which expresses that the derived subject is often adversely affected by the action. The two types of passive strategy in Japanese are illustrated by examples 34 and 35. Although sentence 34 and 35 are superficially very similar, they in fact exemplify two quite different constructions. Unlike the neutral passive of 34, the affective passive does not rely on the promotion of a direct object to a subject. As a result, the latter construction is not restricted to transitive verbs, as in number 36 and 37. Passivization is thus widely used in Japanese. Miller-Gotama 1993 claims that Japanese falls somewhat short of the level of semantic transparency found in Korean. The range of relevant morphosyntactic contrast is more extensive. When compared with Korean, Japanese has a greater number of syntactic constructions, wherein an apparently simplex surface structure has a substructure embedded within it and underlying representations, as shown in the examples in number 38 to 46. Consider the examples in 38 to 46. Causative constructions, desiderative constructions, affective passive constructions, potential constructions, favor-giving constructions, favor-receiving constructions, and so on. Syntactic constructions illustrated by examples 38a to 46a are those which mask or disguise the underlying embedded structures under their simplex structures. The fact that Japanese possess a greater number of such constructions indicate that Japanese tends to show less semantic transparency than Korean. The discussion in this subsection shows that Japanese attests a greater number of syntactic constructions with low semantic transparency. The contrast discussed in sections 4.1 and 4.2 can be summarized as in Table 5. That is, in terms of morphosyntactic parameters number 1, semantic transparency of grammatical morphology, Japanese is lower, Korean is higher. In terms of syntactic constructions with low semantic transparency, Japanese has more, Korean has less. The morphosyntactic contrast presented so far lead us to the following generalizations. Where the morphosyntax of Korean and Japanese contrast, the surface morphological and syntactic forms of Korean are in closer correspondence with their associated meanings. There is great ambiguity of surface forms in Japanese, namely collapsing of semantic distinctions and of different semantic types onto common surface forms. The result is more of one-to-one mapping in Korean, with distinct forms carrying distinct meanings to a greater extent. There is also less correspondence between surface clause structure and semantic clause structure in Japanese. Now let's move on to other parameters, parameters number 3 to number 7, starting from raising 4.3. Among the morphosyntactic parameters mentioned in 23, parameters from number 3 to number 7 do not appear to yield remarkable morphosyntactic differences between Japanese and Korean, at least qualitatively. Parameter 3, raising, is a phenomenon in which a linguistic element appears in a higher clause than is semantically appropriate. The following English example number 47 illustrate the raising phenomenon. 47a is subject to subject raising. B is subject-object raising. Raising as a type of syntactic movement arguably existing in English is expected to be virtually non-existent in Japanese and Korean. However, there is one syntactic construction in Japanese which appears to be an instance of subject-object raising, as shown in number 48. 야마다와 다나카가 한닌다 또 단테이시다. B. 야마다와 다나카 오 한닌다 또 단테이시다. The complement clause subject tanaka, which is marked by the nominative case particle ka in 48a, is apparently promoted to the matrix clause object in 48b, marked by the accusative case particle o. There is a constraint that the presumed raising process is grammatical only when the verb of the complement clause is a form of copula. The counterpart to Japanese raising construction 48b is fully acceptable in Korean too, as shown in 49. (49b) 영수는 철수를 범인이라고 단정했다. There is no subject-to-subject raising in Japanese. There is no evidence of subject-to-subject raising in Korean either. However, it could be argued that object-to-subject raising may exist in Korean as shown in number 50b. 언어하기 공부하기가 쉽다. It is disputable whether this can be regarded as object-to-subject raising. It must therefore be asked whether a raising analysis is the correct derivation of sentences in Korean. If it is the case, as raising is a process that reduces semantic transparency considerably, the apparent availability of object-subject raising poses a problem to Korean that has been considered to exhibit a remarkable semantic transparency. It could be disputable. Now move on to word order freedom. Section 4.4, word order freedom. Regarding parameter 4, Japanese and Korean are both characterized as the SOV language, wherein so-called case particles or postpositions allow subject NPs and object NPs to be scrambled, as shown in 51 and 51 prime. In examples 51 and 51 prime, the three arguments NPs in the parentheses can be freely scrambled both in Japanese and Korean. The word order freedom parameter 4 thus fails to differentiate Japanese and Korean properly. Parameter 5 and 6, that is section 4.5, extraction and pied piping. Parameter 5 and parameter 6 concern syntactic operations originally proposed by early generative grammarians. Parameter 5, extraction, refers to the movement of a relativized NP or a WH word from within an embedded complement clause, as shown in 52. Parameter 6, pied piping, is the optional movement of an NP or PP containing the item which is affected by a movement rule. The pied piping construction is illustrated by example 53. This is the woman, the daughter of whom I know. The non-pied piping counterpart of 53 is 53 prime. This is the woman I know, the daughter of. In Japanese and Korean, there is widespread agreement that no movement is involved in relativization. Furthermore, extraction of a WH word from within an embedded complement clause does not exist in Japanese and Korean, as shown in 54 and 54 prime. On availability of the syntactic movement in both Japanese and Korean renders parameters 5 and 6 irrelevant in highlighting their morphosyntactic differences. Finally, sentence 55b shows that extraction from a nominalized clause is not possible either. Deletion of NPs. Parameter 7, deletion of NPs, according to the original conception of Hawkins, refers to gaps in surface structures where no movement is involved. A typical instance of deletion of NPs in language like English is so-called conjunction reduction, which is shown in 56. Japanese and Korean are known to show high frequency of deletion, also referred to as ellipses, not only of NPs but also of other sentential constituents as well, in both speech and writing, as compared to language like English and German. What is particularly noteworthy about ellipsis phenomena in Japanese and Korean is the strong tendency for contextually recoverable sentence constituents to be omitted. For example, first and second person pronouns and their equivalents, as shown in 57 and 58. Number 57, 하나가 또 애가에 있다노? 응, 있다요. 58, 만났니? 안 만났어. Although quantitative studies are necessary to determine the relative frequency differences in ellipses, if any, between the two languages, it is safe to say that both Japanese and Korean exhibit ellipsis phenomena abundantly, particularly in spoken language. Parameter 7, therefore, does not serve to highlight the morphosyntactic contrast between the two languages, at least qualitatively. So far, based on Hori 2005 and Miller-Gotama 1993, we have contrasted morphosyntactic structures of Japanese and Korean by examining some relevant parameters of Hawkins' comparative typology. The morphosyntactic contrast thus examined consistently show that Japanese is more tolerant of one-to-many correspondences between form and meaning than Korean. In other words, Korean presents a correspondence between surface form and semantic representation. However, the parameters number 3 to number 7 turned out to be irrelevant to prove any differences between Korean and Japanese. We need to develop more relevant parameters to agglutinative non-configurational languages like Korean and Japanese, as the parameters 3 to 7 seem to be more relevant to fusional configurational languages like English and German. Summary. I will briefly read out a summary. In addition to lexico-grammatical similarities presented in Table 1, Korean and Japanese show striking similarities in terms of morphosyntactic behaviors, such as the use of converbs and grammaticalized patterns of auxiliary verbs. B, a systematic comparison of the two languages, despite their striking similarities, reveals subtle yet systematic differences. Korean tends to prefer verb-oriented structures and Japanese noun-oriented structures. C, given a situation in which affectedness must be expressed, Korean tends to employ agent-oriented constructions, whereas Japanese tends to employ AffecteeOriented constructions. In other words, Korean is more agent-oriented than Japanese in terms of expression of affectedness. D, when we contrast the grammars of Korean and Japanese using Hawkins parameters, it can be said that the surface morphological syntactic forms of Korean are in closer correspondence with their associated meanings. E, there is greater ambiguity of surface forms in Japanese, collapsing of semantic distinctions and of different semantic types onto common surface forms. The result is more of a one-to-one mapping in Korean, with distinct forms carrying distinct meanings to a greater extent. F, there is less correspondence between surface clause structure and semantic clause structure in Japanese. G, except for the differences based on two parameters, namely grammatical morphology and semantic diversity of grammatical relations. However, Hawkins' other parameters turned out to be less useful in revealing the morphosyntactic differences between Korean and Japanese. We need to develop more relevant parameters to agglutinative non-configurational languages like Korean and Japanese, as Hawkins' parameters seem to be more relevant to fusional configurational languages. Thank you for your attention.